This is the story of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. A Boeing 737 MAX 8 was flying from Bole International Airport in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi, Kenya. The plane departed at 8:08 a.m. local time, and the flight was expected to last about an hour. But shortly after takeoff, the pilots struggled with the plane, and they tried to divert to a nearby airport. However, both pilots ended up losing control of the plane, and they crashed into a field outside of Addis. This crash killed all 149 passengers and 8 crew members that were on board. Before we continue, go ahead and subscribe for more videos like this one. Also, don't forget to hit the like button. And without further ado, let's get into the video. The history of the plane. The plane that was involved in this accident was the 737 MAX 8. It had its first flight on May 2017, and it was delivered to the airline on February 2019. The plane had flown 1256 cycles in 2,298 hours before the crash. At the time of the crash, the plane was worth around $94 million. The flight? On March 10, 2019, the pilots of the ill-fated flight performed a walk-around of the aircraft. No abnormalities were found during the walk-around. Before takeoff, the pilots discussed the possibility of thunderstorms along their route of flight. They also set the flight management system to the initial approach and departure procedure for runway 06 at the destination airport. After the pilots got clearance to take off, they took off. During the initial climb, the pilots followed the automated climb guidance very closely. The plane reached its planned altitude, a flight of 29,000 feet or 8,800 meters. Shortly after reaching their planned altitude, the pilots noticed that there were clouds in the area, so they decided to deviate from their flight plan in order to avoid some of those clouds. At this point, the plane was at 27,000 feet or 8,200 meters. Shortly after this, the pilots turned on the autopilot system and engaged the altitude hold mode. They also set the target altitude to 29,000 feet or 8,800 meters. While they were doing this, the ground proximity warning system came on, and it warned the pilots that they were too low. At this point, the plane was at an altitude of 26,000 feet or 7,900 meters. The pilots then reset the altitude and the GPWS went silent. At this point, the pilots decided to switch off the autopilot system because they did not want to fly through the clouds, so they manually flew the plane out of the clouds. After doing this, the captain noticed that the plane had lost quite a bit of altitude, so he selected 29,000 feet or 8,800 meters as the new target altitude. He then re-engaged the autopilot system and the plane started climbing once again. But then the ground proximity warning system activated and said that the plane was too low. The pilots quickly disabled the autopilot system, and they started manually controlling the plane. But by this time, the plane was too low, and it impacted terrain. The plane was traveling at a speed of 480 knots, or 774 kilometers per hour when it hit the ground. It was also at an altitude of 7,400 feet, or 2,200 meters above sea level. This was 2,000 feet or 610 meters below the minimum safe altitude. Upon impact with the ground, the plane was in a nose-down attitude of about 20 degrees. The plane broke up in mid-air and pieces of the plane rained down over a wide area. The investigation. After the crash, an emergency meeting was held, and all flights involving the Boeing 737 MAX 8 were grounded. An emergency meeting was also held by the International Civil Aviation Authority, and they said that they would issue a directive to the airlines that were operating the Boeing 737 MAX, but this directive could only be issued once the investigation was completed. Once the investigation was completed, it showed that the crash was caused by a chain of events that eventually led to the crash. The first thing that happened was that the angle of attack sensors on the plane failed. These sensors are supposed to tell the plane what angle the plane is making with the horizon, but these sensors gave erroneous data to the plane's computers. Because of this, the plane thought that it was flying at a higher angle than it actually was. This meant that the plane's computer activated the trim system to push the plane's nose down. As I mentioned earlier, the trim system is basically a series of motors that move the horizontal stabilizer of the plane to either push the plane's nose up or down. But since the plane's computer thought that the plane was at a high angle of attack, it commanded the trim system to push the plane's nose down. This may have been done to maintain the plane's altitude. The pilots tried to counteract this by pushing the control columns forward, but this caused the trim system to push the plane's nose down even more. This is because the trim system has priority over the pilots. So if the trim system is on and the pilots try to go against it, the trim system will win. This is a good thing, because if the trim system fails, the pilots should be able to correct the plane. But in this case, the trim system was the problem, so the pilots were unable to control the plane. But why did the angle of attack sensor fail? Well, during the certification process of the Boeing 737 MAX, Boeing told the FAA that the angle of attack sensor would not be tested during maintenance checks. The reason for this was because they said that the angle of attack sensor was a highly reliable component, and it would not fail. Unfortunately, this was not the case. One of the angle of attack sensors on the plane failed shortly after the plane entered service. Boeing knew about this failure, and they told the FAA that it was normal. According to Boeing, the sensor had a small discrepancy in its readings, but according to the FAA, the sensor's discrepancies were larger than acceptable limits. Now, you might be wondering why this information is important. Well, this information is important because it tells us how this crash occurred. Basically, the small discrepancies that Boeing deemed as normal were actually outside of acceptable limits. If the FAA had insisted on the angle of attack sensor being tested during maintenance checks, then maybe the sensor would have been caught earlier. This is very important because once the sensor failed completely, the pilots would have been able to catch it. But in this case, the sensor's gradual decline caused the pilots to be tricked. By the time they realized that something was wrong, it was too late. In the cockpit, there were several indicators that pointed towards the angle of attack sensor failing. For example, when the plane took off, the pilots noticed that the plane was oscillating. They even talked about this, and the captain said that the oscillations were abnormal. The oscillations lasted for about 8 minutes, and then they stopped. What the pilots did not know was that the oscillations were caused by the angle of attack sensor giving them false information. After this incident, several 737 MAX planes experienced similar incidents, but no other plane crashed. The 737 MAX has since been cleared to fly, but several airlines still do not want to operate it. What could have been done differently? There were several things that could have been done differently to prevent this crash. First of all, the angle of attack sensor should have been tested during routine checks. This could have prevented the sensor's failure from going undetected for so long. Also, the trim system should have been designed in a way where the pilots could have overridden it. Doing this would have allowed the pilots to regain control of the plane. Finally, the pilots could have recognized that the plane was in a dangerous situation much earlier. But they were focused on other things, and they did not realize that they were losing control of the plane. In conclusion, the crash of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 was a terrible tragedy. All 149 people and 8 crew members on board died. But the good news is that we learned a lot from this crash. We learned about the dangers of the Boeing 737 MAX 8, and we learned about the importance of thorough testing. Let us hope that we can learn from our mistakes and prevent similar accidents from happening in the future. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked it, please hit the like button and subscribe. Also, if you have any video suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I'll see you next time. Stay safe.